The moment I found my own name carved into that dead oak tree, dated 3 weeks into the future, I understood that some places in these mountains keep records of things that haven't happened yet. Before we begin, please consider subscribing. And don't forget to like the video and share it with your close friends and family. I would also love to hear where you are listening from. Thank you all for the support. It truly means a lot to me. Now, let's start. I'd been researching abandoned coal communities in southern West Virginia for my doctoral thesis on rural depopulation when I first heard about Anstead Hollow. The name appeared nowhere on modern maps, which wasn't unusual for these mountains where entire towns had been swallowed by kudzu and economic collapse. What was unusual were the county records I found in the basement of the McDowell County Courthouse. Pages that had been misfiled, or perhaps deliberately hidden, documenting a community of nearly 400 souls that had seemingly vanished over the course of a single winter in 1952. No deaths recorded, no forwarding addresses, just an abrupt cessation of tax payments, school enrollments, and utility connections. The elderly clerk who helped me access the archives grew visibly uncomfortable. When I mentioned the name Anstead Hollow, she told me that her grandmother had spoken of that place only once, on her deathbed, and that she'd begged her family never to go looking for it. The hollow, she said, was where the mountains kept their deads. I asked her what that meant, but she just shook her head and returned to her filing, her hands trembling against the manila folders. I found the hollow on December 7th, 2019. After 3 days of hiking through terrain that seemed to resist navigation. My GPS had failed within the first hour, displaying coordinates that placed me somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. My compass spun lazily, never settling on a direction. I followed the only consistent landmark I could find, a creek that ran the color of rust, threading through valleys where the trees grew at wrong angles, their branches reaching downward as if trying to bury themselves. The forest here was silent in a way that felt deliberate, as though something had asked the birds and insects to leave and they had obliged without argument. The town revealed itself at dusk, emerging from the fog like a photograph developing in acid. The buildings were remarkably preserved, their wooden frames silver with age, but structurally sound, as though time had forgotten them rather than passed them by. I counted 23 houses, a church with a steeple that leaned toward the mountain as if in supplication, a general store with faded advertisements for products that hadn't been manufactured in 70 years, and a school whose windows were still intact, still holding back whatever darkness had accumulated inside. It was in the clearing behind the church that I found the oak tree. Massive and long dead, its trunk was covered in carvings that stretched from the exposed roots to the lowest branches. Names and dates etched into the bark with what must have been obsessive precision. I recognized some surnames from the county records, the families who had lived here before the disappearance. But the dates beside them were wrong. They extended forward in time, reaching past the 1950s into decades that hadn't occurred yet when the town was abandoned. The most recent date I could find was April 15th, 2024. Beside a name I didn't recognize, Sarah Chun. The carving looked fresh, the exposed wood still pale and weeping sap. I walked the circumference of the tree, documenting the names with my phone camera, which had somehow retained its charge despite my GPS failure. The flash illuminated hundreds of entries, perhaps thousands, a catalog of identities that seemed to encompass more people than had ever lived in this hollow. And then my light fell on a section of bark near the base, where the carving was so fresh that wood shavings still clung to the letters, and I read my own name, my full legal name that I'd never spoken aloud to anyone in West Virginia, followed By December 28, 2019, the temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath crystallized before my face, and I heard something that I can only describe as the sound of the mountains settling. A deep groan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from beneath my feet and from the spaces between the stars. I ran. I ran without thinking about direction or destination, crashing through underbrush that clawed at my clothes and skin, until I emerged onto a paved road I'd never seen before, gasping and bleeding, in the parking lot of a gas station in Welch. The attendant told me I'd been gone for 6 days. My university had filed a missing persons report. Search parties had combed the mountains without finding any trace of me or the hollow I described. When I showed him the photographs on my phone, every image against that hollow was corrupted, displaying only static and, occasionally, what appeared to be the faint outline of carved names bleeding through the digital noise. I left West Virginia that night and never returned to complete my research. December 28, 2019 came and went without incident, though I spent the entire day locked in my apartment, watching the sun trace its arc across the sky with a desperation I'd never known before. I convinced myself that I was safe, that whatever accounting the mountains kept had failed to collect its debt from me. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself tracing letters on my forearm without meaning to, carving invisible names into my own skin, and I wonder if the hollow is still keeping records, still waiting, still remembering everyone who ever wandered into its keeping. I looked up Sarah Chun last year. She was a graduate student at Virginia Tech, studying folklore. She'd posted on a hiking forum about searching for abandoned Appalachian communities. Her last post was dated April 10th, 2024. I tried to warn her. I sent messages, emails, even called the university. But no one could find any record of a student by that name. And when I checked the forum again, her posts had disappeared, replaced by blank spaces where her words should have been, as though she'd never existed at all. As though the hollow had already claimed her and was simply waiting for the calendar to catch up with what it had always known. Mapped every forgotten hollow and abandoned mining track for the state's Rural Development Commission. But I have never been able to find that road again, the one that led to a gas station attendant who'd been dead for 40 years in a town that had burned down before I was born. The January of 2022 brought the worst ice storm the region had seen in decades, coating every surface in 2 inches of frozen rain that turned the mountains into a glittering, treacherous wonderland. I was driving back from a survey in Hazard when my GPS began routing me down roads I'd never encountered. Narrow passages that wound between ridges I couldn't identify, descending into a valley where the ice seemed thicker, older somehow, as though winter had arrived here first and never quite left. My phone showed full signal strength but couldn't connect to any network, and the radio produced nothing but a low, continuous hum that rose and fell like breathing. The gas station appeared around a curve I don't remember taking. A small brick building with 2 pumps that looked like relics from the 1970s. The kind with rolling mechanical numbers instead of digital displays. The fluorescent lights inside flickered in a rhythm that seemed almost intentional, illuminating shelves stocked with products and packaging I recognized from my childhood, brands that had been discontinued for decades. A bell chimed when I pushed through the door, though I saw no bell above the frame. And the man behind the counter looked up at me with eyes that held too much recognition for a stranger. He was tall and thin, wearing a uniform that bore the logo of a gas company that had gone bankrupt in the 1980s, and when he smiled, I noticed that his teeth were slightly too white, too perfect, like a photograph that had been retouched. He asked if I needed gas, and I said yes. though something in my stomach had begun to twist with a wrongness I couldn't articulate. He told me Pump 2 was working, and I noticed that his voice had a quality like an old record, warm but containing a faint static that shouldn't have been there. While he processed my payment, a credit card that he studied with the confusion of someone unfamiliar with the technology, I asked him the name of the town. Pemberton, he said, and I felt the blood drain from my face because I knew that name. Knew it from the county fire reports I'd studied. A town that had burned to the ground in 1983 when a mine collapse released methane gas. That found a spark in someone's kitchen. Must have shown something on my face because the man's smile faltered, and for just a moment, less than a second, I saw what was behind his expression, a profound and ancient weariness. The look of someone who had been performing the same scene for longer than human memory should allow. He handed back my card and asked if I was planning to stay long, and the question carried a weight that made my hands tremble. I told him I was just passing through, and he nodded slowly, as though that was both the expected and the correct answer. Before I could reach the door, he said something that has haunted me ever since. He said, "They all say that, but the road loops, friend. Sooner or later, everyone comes back through Pemberton." I pumped gas that smelled slightly wrong, like it, had been sitting in the ground too long, and I drove out of that valley as fast as the ice would allow, following the road as it climbed back into terrain I recognized, spitting me out onto Highway 15 near Whitesburg as though I'd never left. When I checked my receipt later, the transaction didn't exist in my bank records, and the paper itself had begun to fade, the ink becoming transparent within hours until nothing remained but a blank white slip that crumbled to dust when I touched it. I researched Pemberton obsessively after that night, digging through microfilm archives and interviewing elderly residents who remembered the fire. 107 people had died in those flames, including a gas station attendant named Earl Whitmore, who had stayed at his post calling in the emergency while the fire rolled toward him, giving others time to escape at the cost of his own life. I found a photograph of Earl in a newspaper obituary, and he looked exactly like the man who had sold me gas, down to the small scar above his left eyebrow that I hadn't consciously noticed but now couldn't forget. I've driven those roads 100 times since that January night, in every season and weather condition, at every hour of day and night, but I've never found the turn that leads to that valley, that gas station, that man who should have been ash in memory for 40 years. Sometimes I catch myself hoping I'll find it again, just to prove to myself that it happened, that I didn't imagine the whole encounter in some ice-induced fugue state. But a larger part of me, the part that remembers the way Earl's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the part that heard the warning in his voice, that part hopes I never find the road to Pemberton again, because I've started seeing it in my dreams. Now, the valley and the gas station and the man behind the counter, and in my dreams, I don't drive away. In my dreams, I stay, and the ice keeps falling, and Earl shows me the back room where the others wait. All the travelers who took the wrong turn and couldn't find their way out. And they're still there, still pumping gas that never ends, still waiting for customers who died before I was born. And sometimes, when I wake up, I smell gasoline on my hands, and I find receipts in my pockets that fade before I can read them. And I wonder if I've been visiting Pemberton all along, if the road has already looped back without me knowing. My grandmother used to say that some lights in the mountains are looking for you, and some are hoping you'll be stupid enough to follow them into places where the ground remembers how to swallow. I never believed her until the night I watched that pale glow lead my best friend into the forest, and he came back speaking in a voice that wasn't his own. Marcus and I had been friends since childhood, growing up in the shadow of Black Mountain near the Virginia-Kentucky border, 2 boys who spent their summers exploring abandoned mine shafts and their winters telling each other ghost stories we half believed. We'd heard the tales of strange lights in these hollows all our lives. Ignis Fatuus, the old folks called it, will-o'-the-wisps that were said to be the souls of the lost or the lanterns of spirits trying to lead the living astray. We'd even seen them a few times, distant glows that bobbed between the trees before vanishing like dying embers, and we'd always laughed them off as swamp gas or moonlight reflecting off ice crystals or any of the rational explanations they're comfortable people used to dismiss things they'd rather not believe. The February of 2020 was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache and your lungs burn. And Marcus had suggested we spend the weekend at his family's hunting cabin on the north face of Black Mountain. We'd done it dozens of times before, just 2 old friends drinking beer by a wood stove and pretending we were still young enough for adventure. The first night was normal, quiet, filled with the comfortable silence of people who've known each other long enough that words become optional. But on the second night, around 2 in the morning, Marcus woke me with a grip on my shoulder so tight it left bruises. And when I opened my eyes, I saw the light. It hovered outside the cabin window, a sphere of luminescence about the size of a basketball, glowing with a pale blue-white radiance that cast no shadows and seemed to pulse with something like breath. It was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, the way a flame is beautiful, the way the edge of a cliff is beautiful, and I understood immediately why people followed these things into the dark, why they walked off trails and into ravines chasing something that seemed to promise answers to questions they didn't know they were asking. Marcus was already moving toward the door, his eyes fixed on that light with an expression I'd never seen on his face, something between rapture and terror, and when I called his name, he didn't respond. He didn't even blink. I grabbed his arm, tried to pull him back, but he shook me off with a strength that didn't belong to him, a strength that seemed to flow into his muscles from somewhere else. And he opened the door and stepped out into the frozen night wearing nothing but his underwear and a t-shirt. The light began to move then, drifting backward into the tree line, and Marcus followed it like a sleepwalker, his bare feet crunching through the snow without any sign that he felt the cold. I shouted after him, I pleaded, I even tried to tackle him, but every time I got close, something pushed me back, not physically, but mentally. A pressure behind my eyes that made my thoughts scatter like startled birds. I watched him disappear into the forest, following that ghostly glow until both he and it were swallowed by the darkness between the pines. And I stood there in the doorway of the cabin with tears freezing on my cheeks, knowing that I should go after him, but feeling in my marrow that whatever waited in those woods would take me to if I was foolish enough to follow. I waited all night, stoking the fire and praying to gods I didn't believe in, watching the tree line for any sign of my friend or that terrible, beautiful light. Marcus came back at dawn, walking out of the forest with steady, measured steps that looked rehearsed, like someone mimicking how a human should move. His feet were blackened with frostbite, and he should have been screaming in pain, but his face held no expression at all. Just a smooth blankness that made him look like a mannequin wearing my friend's skin. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The cadence was wrong, the vowels stretched in places they shouldn't, and he used words that Marcus had never known, old words, Scots-Irish phrases that had died out in these mountains a century ago. He said he'd been to a gathering, that he'd met people who'd been living in the hollow places for longer than the trees had been growing, that they'd shown him things about the mountain that no one was supposed to see. Then he smiled, and his smile was the worst part. because it was Marcus's smile but emptied of everything that had made it his. And he asked me if I wanted to go with him next time, if I wanted to see what the lights were guarding. I drove him to the hospital in Weiss, and the doctors couldn't explain how he'd survived the exposure, how his feet had healed within days when they should have required amputation, how his blood work showed anomalies they'd never encountered before. Marcus was released after a week, and physically he seemed fine, better than fine even, but the person who came home wasn't the friend I'd known for 30 years. He moved differently, ate differently, slept during the day and spent the nights at his window watching the tree line with an anticipation that made my stomach turn. His family noticed it too, but no one wanted to say out loud what we all knew, that something had taken Marcus in those woods and sent back a replacement that didn't quite fit. He disappeared 3 months later, walked out of his house on a May evening and never came back. Search parties found no trace of him, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to suggest he'd gone anywhere at all. But I know where he went. I know because I've seen the lights again, 3 times now since that February night, and each time they seem closer, more insistent, pulsing with a rhythm that feels like it's trying to match my heartbeat. My grandmother was right about those lights. They're looking for something or someone, and I think they remembered that I was the one who got away, the one who didn't follow when they called. And sometimes, late at night, I hear Marcus's voice on the wind, or something that sounds like Marcus's voice, inviting me to come see what he found, promising that the cold isn't so bad once you stop fighting it, whispering that there's room for me at the gathering, that there's always room for one more. I collect audio recordings of Appalachian folk music, interviews with elderly musicians, field recordings of shape note singing and ballads that have been passed down for generations. I've never deleted a recording in my entire career until I found the one buried in my files from Carter County, the one that plays my own screams backward and forward simultaneously, recorded 3 days before I ever set foot in Tennessee. The project had been straightforward, a grant-funded documentation of dying musical traditions in the upper reaches of Carter County, where the mountains hold pockets of population so isolated that some families still speak with accents that linguists trace directly to Elizabethan England. I'd spent a week in Johnson City, interviewing musicians and attending church services where congregations sang in harmonies that sounded like they'd stepped out of the 18th century. It was fulfilling work, important work, and I'd felt nothing but gratitude for the opportunity until I drove up to the Appalachian Mountains to meet a woman named Irene Sutton, who was said to know ballads that existed nowhere else in the documented world. Irene lived alone in a cabin that clung to the side of Beauty Spot Mountain, accessible only by a gravel road that turned to mud in the December rain and seemed to get narrower with every mile, as though the forest was trying to squeeze out any intrusion. She was 93 years old, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, whose hands gnarled by arthritis, but still capable of coaxing music from a dulcimer that had been in her family since before the Civil War. She welcomed me warmly, fed me cornbread and beans, and seemed genuinely pleased that someone cared enough about her music to make the journey. The recording session went well at first. Irene's voice was thin with age but carried a haunting clarity, and the songs she sang were unlike anything in my archive, ballads about lovers who returned from wars that never happened, children who grew up in houses that existed only in winter, a woman who traded her shadow for the ability to hear what the mountains were thinking. I noticed that my equipment behaved strangely during some of these songs, the audio meters spiking in ways that didn't match her volume, the recording levels fluctuating as though something else was adding its voice to hers. But I attributed it to the old cabin's electrical system. the way age and isolation can make technology unreliable. It wasn't until I returned to Johnson City that night and began reviewing the recordings that I found it, buried among the properly labeled files, dated and time-stamped. According to my usual system, there was a recording I hadn't made. The file was labeled with my standard naming convention, showed my equipment's serial number in the metadata, and was dated December 14th, 2021, 3 days before I'd arrived in Tennessee, before I'd even known Irene Sutton's name. The timestamp showed 3:33 a.m., and the duration was 47 minutes and 16 seconds. I pressed play with the casual curiosity of someone who thinks they're about to solve a minor technical mystery, a file corruption or a glitch in the dating system, something that would have a rational explanation and a simple fix. What I heard instead was my own voice, screaming. Not just screaming, but pleading, sobbing, begging for something to stop, begging for someone to let me go. The words were garbled, distorted, as though recorded underwater, but I could make out fragments. Not me, please. The song, she's still singing. And beneath my voice, constant and unwavering, was Irene's voice, singing a melody I didn't recognize, a song in a language that sounded like no language I'd ever studied, rising and falling in patterns that made my head ache and my vision blur. The recording ended abruptly at the 47-minute mark, cut off mid-scream, and was immediately followed by silence so complete it felt like a presence, like the absence of sound, had weight and intention. I sat in my hotel room for hours, unable to move, replaying the file and trying to convince myself that it was fake, a prank. Some elaborate hoax perpetrated by someone with access to my equipment and a very specific desire to torment me. But the metadata was clean, the audio analysis showed no signs of splicing or manipulation, and the voice screaming on that recording was mine, unmistakably mine, with all the particular inflections and speech patterns that make a voice as unique as a fingerprint. I drove back to Irene's cabin the next morning, determined to confront her, to demand an explanation, to make sense of something that refused to make sense. But when I arrived, the cabin was gone. Not destroyed or collapsed, just gone, as though it had never existed. The clearing where it had stood was overgrown with trees that had clearly been growing for decades, their roots deep and their trunks thick, and when I checked my GPS coordinates against the route I'd driven the day before, my phone showed nothing but unbroken forest. I asked in town about Irene Sutton, described the cabin and the road and the woman who'd fed me cornbread and sang songs about shadows. The locals exchanged glances that I couldn't read, and finally an old man at the hardware store told me that Irene Sutton had died in 1987, that her cabin had burned down shortly after, and that no one had lived on that part of Beauty Spot Mountain since. I deleted the recording that night, erased every backup, reformatted the drive, threw the SD card into the hotel dumpster. But I can still hear it sometimes, when I'm falling asleep or when I'm driving through mountains that look too much like Tennessee. I hear my own voice screaming, and beneath it, endless and patient, I hear Irene singing that song in a language older than the hills, and I know that somewhere, in some time that exists alongside this one, the recording is still playing, still capturing whatever happened in that cabin that shouldn't exist, still waiting for me to press play and join the chorus. There are things living in the deep places of these mountains that have never seen sunlight, that have evolved in absolute darkness for so long they've forgotten what light means. I know this because I spent 17 hours trapped in an abandoned coal mine with something that breathed like a man but moved like water flowing uphill. And when I finally escaped, It whispered that it would be waiting when I came back. I was part of a documentary crew filming a segment on the history of coal mining in Appalachia, focusing on the abandoned operations that dot the landscape like open wounds. Dangerous reminders of an industry that took everything and left nothing but poverty and black lung and holes in the earth. The Consolidation Mine in Buchanan County had been closed since 1962 after a series of collapses that had trapped and killed 23 miners, and our producer had obtained permission to film a brief segment at the sealed entrance, showing how nature was slowly reclaiming these industrial scars. We were never supposed to go inside. The permits didn't allow it, the insurance didn't cover it, and every safety protocol in our industry screamed against it. But our director was ambitious and reckless, and when he found a secondary entrance that had been overlooked by the sealing crews, an old ventilation shaft hidden behind a curtain of kudzu and autumn debris, he convinced us that a few interior shots would make the difference between a forgettable documentary and an award-winning one. There were 5 of us who descended into that shaft: the director, 2 camera operators, a sound technician, and me, the production assistant whose job it was to carry equipment and keep track of time. We had headlamps and flashlights and a generator-powered lighting rig, enough illumination to make the darkness feel manageable, the kind of darkness you could push back with technology and human will. The mine opened up beyond the shaft into a maze of tunnels and chambers, some still supported by rotting timber. Others collapsed into rubble that we had to climb over or squeeze through. The air was thick and stale, tasting of rust and coal dust and something else. Something organic that I couldn't identify, like the smell of a basement where water has been standing too long. We'd been filming for about 3 hours when the sound technician, a man named Ray who'd been doing this work for 20 years, stopped in the middle of a corridor and asked if anyone else heard breathing. We all went quiet, and in the silence, I heard it too, a rhythmic sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls and the floor and the spaces between our heartbeats, the sound of something inhaling and exhaling with lungs that must have been enormous. The director laughed and said it was just ventilation, old air currents moving through the tunnels, but his laugh was too high and his hands were shaking when he checked his camera. And we all knew that ventilation doesn't sound like it's coming from inside your own chest. The collapse happened without warning, a section of ceiling giving way with a sound like bones breaking, filling the tunnel behind us with tons of rock and trapping us on the wrong side of the only exit we knew. The dust was so thick that our lights became useless, showing nothing but swirling gray particles that seemed almost alive in the beams, and we huddled together in a chamber that had suddenly become a tomb, rationing our flashlight batteries, and trying to remember if anyone had thought to tell someone where we were going. The breathing continued throughout, steady and patient, and now it seemed closer, coming from a specific direction, from a side tunnel that our lights couldn't quite penetrate. A passage that led deeper into the mountain and whatever lived there. The director was the first to see it. He'd wandered toward that side tunnel, drawn by something he couldn't explain, and his flashlight caught it for just a moment before the beam flickered and died. He described it later, when he was sedated and strapped to a hospital bed, screaming between descriptions, something tall and thin, with too many joints in its limbs, skin that looked wet and colorless in the brief flash of light, eyes that reflected nothing because they'd never needed to see. It had been moving toward him, he said, not walking but flowing, its body bending in ways that bones shouldn't allow, and it had been smiling with a mouth that stretched too far across a face that was almost human but somehow worse for the almost we ran without direction, stumbling through the darkness with our dying lights, and the thing followed us, always just behind, always just out of sight. its breathing filling the tunnels until we couldn't tell its breath from our own. I became separated from the others at some point, turned left when they turned right, and found myself alone in a chamber where the floor was covered in something soft that my foot sank into. Something that moved and pulsed beneath my weight, like I was standing on a vast tongue. My last flashlight died there, and I crouched in the absolute darkness for hours, maybe more, listening to that breathing get closer and closer until I could feel the air moving against my face, warm and wet and smelling of coal and copper and something sweeter, something that made me think of decay. It spoke to me. In the darkness, with its breath against my skin, it spoke in a voice that sounded like rock grinding against rock, like coal shifting under pressure, and it asked me my name. I didn't answer. I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up and my mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere far away where things made sense and the dark was just the absence of light rather than a presence with intent. It laughed then, a sound I'll never forget. The sound of mountains settling and miners screaming and children crying in the night. And it told me that it had waited so long for visitors, that the mine had been its home since before there was a mine, since before there were mountains, since the darkness itself had learned to breathe. And then it let me go. It led me, somehow, through tunnels I couldn't see, to a shaft that emerged in a hollow miles from where we'd entered. And as I crawled out into the January dawn with coal dust in my lungs and madness in my eyes, I heard. It whispered that I would be back, that everyone comes back eventually, that the mountain remembers everyone who enters and keeps a space waiting in the dark. The rescue teams found the others 2 days later. All of them alive, but changed, traumatized in ways that therapy has never quite reached. The director still screams in his sleep. Ray never worked in sound again because he says he can still hear the breathing in every quiet moment. And me? I moved to Florida, as far from mountains as I could get, to a place where the land is flat and the darkness isn't deep enough to hold anything. But sometimes, late at night, I feel the floor beneath my bed soften and pulse, and I hear breathing that matches my own, and I know that the thing in the mine is still waiting, still keeping that space warm for my return. The first time I heard them singing, I thought it was beautiful. Children's voices rising from the forest in the small hours of the morning, harmonizing in a way that seemed too perfect, too practiced for the wilderness. By the third night, when I realized the songs had no words and the singers had no shadows, I understood that beauty in these mountains is often just another kind of trap. I'd rented a cabin in the Smoky Mountains for a riding retreat, one of those rustic places that advertised solitude and inspiration, but didn't mention that the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away and cell service was a memory from another life. It was February, the off-season, and the resort manager had seemed almost reluctant to give me the keys, asking twice if I was sure I wanted to stay in cabin 12, the one at the end of the road, the one closest to the forest. I was a whore. Writer looking for atmosphere, and I told him that isolated and unsettling was exactly what I wanted. He looked at me with an expression I didn't understand at the time. Pity mixed with something like resignation, and handed me the keys without another word. The first 2 nights were everything I'd hoped for. I wrote by candlelight while snow fell outside, filling pages with the kind of eerie prose that my publisher had been begging for, channeling the silence and the cold into stories that felt more real than anything I'd written before. The only sounds were the wind in the pines and the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of ice, the natural soundtrack of a mountain winter that seemed designed to inspire dark thoughts. And then, on the third night, around 3 in the morning, I heard the children. The melody was simple at first, just a few notes repeated in a rising pattern, like a lullaby stripped of its words. I assumed I was imagining it, that the isolation and the late hours were playing tricks on my writer's brain, but when I opened the window, the singing grew louder, more complex, harmonies layering on top of each other in arrangements that made my formal music training cringe because they shouldn't have worked. They violated rules of composition that existed for good reason, and yet they were beautiful, heartbreakingly beautiful, the kind of music that makes you want to cry without understanding why. I could see nothing in the darkness beyond the tree line, no lights, no movement, just the endless black of a forest in winter. But the voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding the cabin in a chorus that rose and fell like breathing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on, listening to those voices until dawn broke and the singing faded with the darkness, leaving behind a silence that felt emptier than before. I told myself it was animals, some nocturnal creature whose calls mimicked human voices, a rational explanation that fell apart completely the next night when the singing returned and I heard my name woven into the melody. Not spoken but sung, stretched across notes in a way that made it sound like a prayer or a warning. On the fifth night, I made the mistake of going outside. I don't know what possessed me to do it, what combination of exhaustion and fascination and the hypnotic pull of those voices convinced me that I needed to see the singers, needed to understand what was making sounds that beautiful in the depths of a frozen forest. I bundled myself in every layer I had and stepped off the porch with a flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, recording audio even though I knew the file would probably be useless, even though some part of me already understood that. Whatever I was walking toward didn't want to be documented. I found them in a clearing about 100 yards into the trees, a group of children standing in a perfect circle, their mouths open and moving in unison, their eyes reflecting my flashlight in ways that human eyes shouldn't. There were maybe a dozen of them, ranging in apparent age from 5 or 6 to early teenagers, wearing clothes that belonged to different eras. Colonial homespun next to Victorian dresses, next to denim jackets from the 1950s, as though they'd been gathering here for centuries and each new arrival had simply joined the circle without ever leaving. They had no shadows. The moon was bright enough to cast shadows from every tree and rock around them, but the children stood in pools of shadowless light, as though the darkness was afraid to touch them. The singing stopped when they saw me. All at once, like someone had flipped a switch. Their mouths closed and their heads turned toward me with a synchronization that made my stomach lurch. They stared at me in silence for what felt like hours, those reflective eyes unblinking, their small bodies motionless in the cold. And then the youngest of them, a girl who couldn't have been more than 5, with ringlets of blonde hair and a dress that might have been white once before time and forest had stained it gray. This child smiled at me and opened her mouth and spoke in a voice that was older than the mountains, a voice that contained multitudes, that sounded like every Ma's child who had ever wandered into these woods and never found their way home. She asked me if I wanted to join them, if I wanted to learn the song, if I wanted to stay forever in a place where nothing ever changed and nothing ever hurt, and the darkness was just another friend who kept you company through the long, old nights. I ran. I ran back to the cabin, and I packed my bags and I drove through the night without stopping until I reached Asheville, until I was surrounded by people and lights and noise that drowned out the memory of that music. The audio file I recorded shows nothing but static. 45 minutes of white noise punctuated by occasional sounds that might be voices or might be interference. And the photos I thought I'd taken show only empty forest, trees, and snow and shadows that look almost like children if you stare at them long enough. I never went back to that cabin, never finished my writing retreat, never told anyone the full story until now. But I still hear the singing sometimes, in moments of quiet, in the space between waking and sleeping. A melody that knows my name and promises that there's always room in the circle. Always a place waiting in the forest where the children have been singing since before anyone was alive to hear them. The cabin looked exactly like the photographs my grandmother left behind. The ones she'd burned 3 days before she died. The ones I shouldn't have been able to recognize because they'd been reduced to ash in her fireplace 20 years ago. But I knew it the moment I saw it. Knew it in my bones the way you know your own face in a mirror. And I understood then that some places wait for the people they're meant to consume. My grandmother never spoke about her childhood in West Virginia. When I asked, which was often because children are persistent and the gaps in a family's story itch like wounds, she would change the subject or leave the room, or simply stare at me with eyes that held something I was too young to identify as fear. I learned eventually to stop asking, to accept that whatever had happened in those mountains before she'd fled to Ohio, at 17 was a door she'd locked and thrown away the key. She lived a good life after that, raised my mother, helped raise me, and died at 92 with secrets intact. But 3 days before her death, she called me to her bedside with an urgency that frightened me and pressed a folded piece of paper into my hands, her grip weak but desperate. She made me promise 2 things: that I would burn the photographs she'd hidden in a box under her bed, and that I would never, under any circumstances, go looking for the place they showed. I burned the photographs that night without looking at them. Or I thought I did, and I assumed I'd kept my promise. But you don't choose the things that haunt you. They choose you, and they're patient, and they know how to wait until your defenses are down and your mind is vulnerable to suggestion. I started dreaming about the cabin 6 months after she died, vivid dreams that felt more like memories, showing me a structure I'd never seen in a forest I'd never visited, surrounded by mountains that somehow felt like home. The dreams grew, more frequent and more detailed, until I could sketch the cabin from memory, until I could describe the texture of its weathered boards and the angle of its sagging porch, and the way the single window caught the light of a setting sun. I told myself it was grief, the mind's attempt to fill in the blanks my grandmother had left, but some part of me knew I was lying, knew that the dreams were something else entirely, a summons disguised as imagination. I found myself driving to West Virginia on the winter solstice of 2024, having requested time off work without quite remembering doing so, having packed a bag with clothes and supplies that seemed chosen for a specific destination. The drive felt predetermined, each turn and exit arriving in my mind just before I needed to take it, and by the time I crossed into Roane County, I'd stopped pretending that I was in control of anything. The roads narrowed and the forest closed in, and I followed a path that existed on no map but felt worn smooth by repetition, by generations of people who had driven or walked or ridden this same route, drawn by the same dreams to the same impossible destination. The cabin stood in a clearing that the afternoon light seemed reluctant to enter, a structure that should have collapsed decades ago but remained standing through what could only be called stubbornness, a refusal to yield to time. That felt almost malevolent. I recognized it immediately, not just from my dreams, but from some deeper place, a cellular memory that predated my own existence. And I understood with a clarity that felt like drowning that my grandmother hadn't been running from a place when she'd left West Virginia. She'd been running from this place, from this specific cabin with its specific hunger, and somehow, despite burning the photographs, despite keeping her secrets, despite every precaution a frightened old woman could take, she'd failed to break the chain. Because I was here now, standing where she must have stood, and the door was already opening, swinging inward on hinges that didn't squeak, welcoming me into a darkness that had been waiting for 75 years. The interior was impossible. Not impossible in the way of dreams, where logic bends but maintains some relationship to reality, but truly impossible, physically impossible. A space that was larger inside than outside by an order of magnitude. Rooms opening onto rooms in configurations that made my eyes water and my mind rebel. The walls were covered in photographs, thousands of them, black and white and sepia in color, spanning decades and clothing styles and photographic technologies, and every single one showed a member of my family. I recognized my grandmother. As a young woman, my great-grandmother whom I'd only seen in formal portraits. People I didn't know but whose features echoed in my own face. Generation after generation of people who had found this cabin or been found by it. Who had walked through that door and looked upon these walls and understood what I was beginning to understand. That the cabin collected us, curated us, remembered us long after the world outside had forgotten. I found my own photograph near the back of the furthest room, in a section that seemed newer than the rest. The paper still glossy, the colors still bright. It showed me exactly as I appeared now, wearing the clothes I'd put on that morning, standing in the doorway of the cabin with an expression I didn't recognize. Something between peace and terror that I'd never seen on my own face. The photograph was dated December 21st, 2024. Today's date. But the time stamp in the corner showed 11:47 p.m. Hours from now, and in the photograph, I wasn't alone. Behind me, just visible in the shadows of the cabin's interior, stood shapes that might have been people or might have been something else entirely. Figures whose features were blurred but whose postures suggested anticipation, eagerness, the patience of redditors who know their prey has nowhere left to run. I tried to leave then. God help me, I tried. I turned and ran for the door, but the rooms had shifted, the geometry had changed, and every corridor led deeper into the cabin rather than toward the exit. The light from outside had faded to the gray of dusk, though it had been early afternoon. When I'd entered, and the photographs on the walls seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Faces turning to follow my progress, mouths opening and closing in silent conversation. I could hear something behind me now. The sound of footsteps that didn't quite match my own, the rustle of clothing that I wasn't wearing, the breathing of people who had been dead for generations but still walked these impossible halls. I don't know how I finally escaped. One moment I was lost in a maze of photographs and watching eyes, and the next I was outside, on my knees in the snow, vomiting and weeping and laughing in the hysterical way of someone whose sanity has cracked along. Fault lines they didn't know existed. The cabin stood behind me, unchanged, eternal, its door still open, and as I watched, I saw my grandmother step out onto the porch, young and beautiful and wearing a dress from 70 years ago. And she looked at me with an expression of infinite sadness and infinite patience. And she said that she was sorry, that she'd tried to break the chain but the cabin always finds a way, that I'd come back eventually because everyone comes back eventually, and when I did, she'd be waiting, they'd all be waiting, the whole family, together at last in a place where no one ever has to leave. I drove away as fast as the snow would allow, not daring to look in my rearview mirror, and I haven't been back. But the dreams haven't stopped. If anything, they've gotten more vivid, more insistent, showing me that cabin and those photographs and the faces of relatives I've never met but who know my name, who are calling my name, who are waiting for me to come home. And sometimes, when I wake from these dreams, I find photographs in my apartment that I didn't take, images of the cabin at different times of day, different seasons, different decades, all of them showing that same open door, all of them dated. In the future, all of them waiting for the day when the chain finally pulls tight and I take my place on those walls, remembered forever by a house that never forgets. My grandmother used to say that some lights in the mountains are looking for you, and some are hoping you'll be stupid enough to follow them into places where the ground remembers how to swallow. I never believed her until the night I watched that pale glow lead my best friend into the forest, and he came back speaking in a voice that wasn't his own. Marcus and I had been friends since childhood, growing up in the shadow of Black Mountain near the Virginia-Kentucky border, two boys who spent their summers exploring abandoned mine shafts and their winters telling each other ghost stories we half believed. We'd heard the tales of strange lights in these hollows all our lives. Ignis Fatuus, the old folks called it, will-o'-the-wisps that were said to be the souls of the lost or the lanterns of spirits trying to lead the living astray. We'd even seen them a few times, distant glows that bobbed between the trees before vanishing like dying embers, and we'd always laughed them off as swamp gas or moonlight reflecting off ice crystals or any of the rational explanations they're comfortable people used to dismiss things they'd rather not believe. The February of 2020 was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache and your lungs burn. And Marcus had suggested we spend the weekend at his family's hunting cabin on the north face of Black Mountain. We'd done it dozens of times before, just two old friends drinking beer by a wood stove and pretending we were still young enough for adventure. The first night was normal, quiet, filled with the comfortable silence of people who've known each other long enough that words become optional. But on the second night, around 2 in the morning, Marcus woke me with a grip on my shoulder so tight it left bruises. And when I opened my eyes, I saw the light. It hovered outside the cabin window, a sphere of luminescence about the size of a basketball, glowing with a pale blue-white radiance that cast no shadows and seemed to pulse with something like breath. It was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, the way a flame is beautiful, the way the edge of a cliff is beautiful, and I understood immediately why people followed these things into the dark, why they walked off trails and into ravines chasing something that seemed to promise answers to questions they didn't know they were asking. Marcus was already moving toward the door, his eyes fixed on that light with an expression I'd never seen on his face, something between rapture and terror, and when I called his name, he didn't respond. He didn't even blink. I grabbed his arm, tried to pull him back, but he shook me off with a strength that didn't belong to him, a strength that seemed to flow into his muscles from somewhere else. And he opened the door and stepped out into the frozen night wearing nothing but his underwear and a t-shirt. The light began to move then, drifting backward into the tree line, and Marcus followed it like a sleepwalker, his bare feet crunching through the snow without any sign that he felt the cold. I shouted after him, I pleaded, I even tried to tackle him, but every time I got close, something pushed me back, not physically, but mentally. A pressure behind my eyes that made my thoughts scatter like startled birds. I watched him disappear into the forest, following that ghostly glow until both he and it were swallowed by the darkness between the pines. And I stood there in the doorway of the cabin with tears freezing on my cheeks, knowing that I should go after him, but feeling in my marrow that whatever waited in those woods would take me to if I was foolish enough to follow. I waited all night, stoking the fire and praying to gods I didn't believe in, watching the tree line for any sign of my friend or that terrible, beautiful light. Marcus came back at dawn, walking out of the forest with steady, measured steps that looked rehearsed, like someone mimicking how a human should move. His feet were blackened with frostbite, and he should have been screaming in pain, but his face held no expression at all. Just a smooth blankness that made him look like a mannequin wearing my friend's skin. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The cadence was wrong, the vowels stretched in places they shouldn't, and he used words that Marcus had never known, old words. Scots-Irish phrases that had died out in these mountains a century ago. He said he'd been to a gathering, that he'd met people who'd been living in the hollow places for longer than the trees had been growing, that they'd shown him things about the mountain that no one was supposed to see. Then he smiled, and his smile was the worst part, because it was Marcus's smile but emptied of everything that had made it his. And he asked me if I wanted to go with him next time, if I wanted to see what the lights were guarding. I drove him to the hospital in Weiss, and the doctors couldn't explain how he'd survived the exposure, how his feet had healed within days when they should have required amputation, how his blood work showed anomalies they'd never encountered before. Marcus was released after a week, and physically he seemed fine, better than fine even, but the person who came home wasn't the friend I'd known for 30 years. He moved differently, ate differently, slept during the day and spent the nights at his window watching the tree line with an anticipation that made my stomach turn. His family noticed it too, but no one wanted to say out loud what we all knew, that something had taken Marcus in those woods and sent back a replacement that didn't quite fit. He disappeared 3 months later, walked out of his house on a May evening and never came back. Search parties found no trace of him, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to suggest he'd gone anywhere at all. But I know where he went. I know because I've seen the lights again, 3 times now since that February night, and each time they seem closer, more insistent, pulsing with a rhythm that feels like it's trying to match my heartbeat. My grandmother was right about those lights. They're looking for something, or someone, and I think they remembered that I was the one who got away, the one who didn't follow when they called. And sometimes, late at night, I hear Marcus's voice on the wind, or something that sounds like Marcus's voice, inviting me to come see what he found, promising that the cold isn't so bad once you stop fighting it, whispering that there's room for me at the gathering, that there's always room for one more.